We had a student here, Julia James, who asked me one day, why is it that we have classes on Dr. King's holiday? We used to come back, you guys used to come back, students used to come back, and we had classes that Monday. And she said, we need to do something. So that Wednesday, the next year after she came to us with that conversation, that question in the Cultural Center, we started honoring Dr. King the Wednesday after you returned to campus. So this is a tradition. It's a tradition that the Martin Luther King Committee of Geneva has always supported. It's a tradition that we welcomed. We have some members of the committee here who worked tirelessly, I think it was only a week ago, to give you a wonderful 47th anniversary march in downtown Geneva. And so Geneva is very proud of not what this event represents, but the time that we have spent here in Geneva celebrating and working for the things that are right and just. We hope that our president, our new president Vincent, will inspire you, that you will take the things that he will say to you to heart, that as students, you will continue to do the things that are right, stand up for what is just, and have a voice, right? So with that, I would like to welcome Sadiq. Okay, and I am going to meet Sadiq for the first time.
It is my honor to now introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Gregory Vincent, a national expert on civil rights, social justice, and campus culture, who has devoted his entire life to equity and justice. His scholarship and teaching explore issues of educational equity and access, diversity in education, engagement and partnerships between communities and universities, and workplace discrimination. Prior to joining HWS last year, President Vincent served at the University of Texas at Austin as Vice President for Diversity and Community Engagement, W.K. Kellogg Professor of Community College Leadership, and Professor of Law. In 2016, President Vincent played a major role in the case of Fisher versus the University of Texas, in which the United States Supreme Court ruled to uphold the use of affirmative action in higher education. He is a lifetime member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, serving as National Chair of the Commission on Racial Justice. During his career, President Vincent has been a civil rights attorney, a professor, and a college administrator. A statesman on both Hobart basketball and cross-country teams, Vincent majored in history and economics at Hobart and William Smith. He earned his law degree from The Ohio State University and a doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania. Today, we are proud to call him our president, the first alum in our history to be named president, and I'm especially proud to call him my fraternity brother. Ladies and gentlemen, from the class of 1983, President Gregory Vincent.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It is truly an honor to be here this evening. When I talked with Dr. Street and Molina about how to schedule this, I thought that it would be good to use this as one of my first opportunities to present to you. You all often see me as a college president and doing things on campus, but this is certainly one of my passions, and so I'm excited about presenting, and it's certainly someone who has very much shaped my life. And I first want to thank our president of Upsilon Pi, Sadiq Walker, and all of the distinguished brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity. Thank you all for serving as hosts this evening. You all look fantastic. And certainly want to thank the MLK committee. They did a great job last week, and again, special thanks to Dr. Streeter and Dr. Molina for doing such a great job. Can we give them again a round of applause? So, one of the things that, before I get into my remarks, that I actually shared this first during the convocation address that I gave in 2016 here at the colleges. And I shared that upon graduation, I was awarded the Martin Luther King Leadership Award. And of course I was honored, but then as the summer went on, I had a sense of dread. I had a sense of dread because I said, what did I do to deserve it? What did I do to earn such a distinguished honor? And to the point where I thought that's what I was going to write in my law school applications, about how I was unworthy of that. And my parents, in their infinite wisdom, said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. Why don't you do this? Why don't you dedicate your life to living up to that award? And so for these last 30 years, that's what I've tried to do. And so I'm always, and I remain grateful for that honor and the faith that Dean Fox and Dean Butler had in me all those years ago. And I hope I have lived up to that. I certainly want to thank Dr. Mallard. I know can't be here. I know we have another very important event this evening. But again, I want to recognize her as the leader of the NAACP. She needs no introduction, but I just want to give her a shout out. And of course, I want to just take another opportunity to recognize the life and legacy of Dr. Rosa Blue. For over 60 years, urged the city to realize the promise and Dr. King's idea of a beloved community, which is built on an understanding, a redeeming goodwill for all, overflowing love, which is purely spontaneous, unmotivated, groundless, and creative. Rosa took up that as her life's work. She was the first female president of the Geneva NAACP, an organizer of the first march in Geneva to bring the community together in honor of Dr. King, and a fierce advocate for the community. She represented the very best of us, and that's why the colleges gave her an honorary doctorate in 2012. She was a sterling example of what it means to lead a life of consequence. We cannot gather without honoring her and paying tribute to her legacy tonight. And I just want to take a moment to just again celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Rosa Blue. So tonight, a week after Dr. Martin Luther King Day, on the 1-year anniversary of the original Women's March, and in the midst of the Me Too movement, as we experience congressional gridlock around issues vital to our national well-being, as we witness attacks on the First Amendment by elected officials sworn to uphold its integrity, as we celebrate the life of Dr. King in the 50th year since his death, I thought it would be appropriate to begin with something Dr. King said in what turned out to be his final public address he gave. All we say to America is, be true to what you said on paper. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for that right. And he went on to say, if I lived in a totalitarian country, maybe I could understand. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they hadn't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere, these rights have to be protected. And so for us, what we're really talking about is, in my mind, what makes this country the shining light for individual liberty. And it's something that we all should commit to. I know you all have read it, but I think it bears, because there's a lot in there. So let's kind of go through it. So the first thing it says is that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Stop there. What the framers are really talking about there is making sure that we had no state-sponsored religion. And so the First Amendment protects not only the prohibition against a state-sponsored religion, but also the free exercise and the diversity of religion. So you have the freedom to practice your faith or not at all. And that is your fundamental right. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of that religion, or abridging freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably to assemble, or to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now remember, what is it doing here? It's prohibiting Congress, right? The government from prohibiting these things, right? So making sure that the Congress shall not create a state-sponsored religion to prohibit freedom of speech, or limit the press, or limit the right of people to peacefully assemble, or, and most importantly, to complain about your government. And whether it's your county supervisor, Blue Guard, or the president. This guarantees that you have the right to do that, and no government official can abridge or impact that right. That is powerful. So, progression of free speech. And in this landmark decision, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes' Supreme Court said, the principle of free thought is not free thought for those who we agree with us, but freedom for the thought we hate. Not for the speech we agree with, but for the speech we hate. Sounds good in theory, right? But what happens when you're confronted in real time with speech that you vehemently disagreed with? And I had that moment in law school. I was taking advanced constitutional law with my favorite professor, and he was sharing with me this case, and he shared that he was the regional director of the ACLU, and he defended the Nazis' right to march in Skokie, Illinois. I said, what? How does that happen? So, like all good students, right, I went to his office hours. I said, Professor, you have to help me with this. I don't get it. Now, let me add a little more context. My favorite professor also happened to be Jewish, and this community, this was not an accident they picked Skokie, Illinois. This was an enclave for Jews who were looking to avoid discrimination. And so it was very intentional that the Nazi Party picked Skokie to march. And David Goldberger defended them. So going back to this, the principle of free thought is not for those we agree with us, but freedom for thought we hate. So when we talk about free speech, it's not just the warm, fuzzy stuff. It's when we're confronted with this, when people burn the flag. This is what free speech is. This is when the rubber meets the road. So when you of course you've heard of ACLU, but I thought it was important that you see what the ACLU was created to do, was to defend and preserve individual rights and liberties, even when they're Nazis. Okay, next slide. So, we're talking about freedom of speech on a college campus. And one of the things that you'll see in these cases is how time after time the Supreme Court has upheld the right of academic freedom in higher education. And how, despite challenges from the government to curtail that speech, that time and time again the Supreme Court has said, this is fundamental to who and what we are and to the free pursuit of knowledge. And so what's important about this 1940 statement that still endures today is that the reason why we promote this, this protection of search for truth and free exposition is because it's for the common good. The belief is that by having unfettered access and the ability to search for truth, that all of us benefit from that pursuit. So the common good is part of who we are. It's a very foundation of democracy and citizenship. Next slide. And so in this again, now, by show of hands, anyone remember the Griswold decision? See, my Connecticut person understands. That was a very famous privacy case where the government tried to come in and interfere with the private relations of a couple. And so here, in this case, Justice Douglas, again in the Supreme Court, said, the right of freedom of speech, very similar, again, reiterating what we saw in the First Amendment, freedom of speech includes not only the right to utter or to print, but the right to distribute, the right to receive, the right to read, and the freedom of inquiry, freedom of thought, and the freedom to teach. Indeed, the freedom of the entire university community. Without these rights, we would be less secure. So again, taking yet another opportunity to read into the record these protections that we hold dear. Okay, next slide. So, why is that important? Because one of the things that makes constitutional law so exciting is that you have competing interests. And it's always interesting to find out which group is going to win. And so in this famous case, you had national security interest versus freedom of speech. Who's going to win? Well, we'll see. So the University of New Hampshire invited a Marxist who had some very powerful thoughts about communism and Marxism, and so to the point where the government, the state of New Hampshire, felt that this was a national security threat to have Mr. Sweezy speak on campus. And the Supreme Court said, in weighing between these national security interests and the freedom of speech, if you play the rock, paper, scissors game, freedom of speech trumps national security. And I find that really fascinating because you would think that because of our protection of national security, that would reign supreme, but not in this case. So even when you had a speaker who was espousing ideas that were in opposition to our very function of government, the Supreme Court said that is permissible speech and should be protected. And so this is a key part of our law. When we think through free speech, it is even when there's a claim by the government that it interferes with national security. Next slide. And so out of that comes the very foundation of what we know to be academic freedom. And it really comes down to 4 key freedoms. To determine for itself on academic grounds who may teach, that is the role of the university, who may be taught, how it shall be taught, and who may be admitted to study. And so for 60 years, that principle has been consistently upheld by the Supreme Court. That is the role of the university and the faculty to make those determinations. And those protections are there, even when faculty teach some crazy stuff. And in this case, again, where the state of New York said that by inviting this dissident to campus, that it was interfering with national security, Justice Brennan, in his majority opinion, reiterated that protection. So our nation is deeply committed to safeguarding academic freedom, which is of transcendent value to all of us and not merely to the teachers concerned. What's important there is that this is the very foundation of citizenship and democracy. It's bigger than this individual transaction. And that freedom is therefore a special concern of the First Amendment, which does not tolerate laws that cast a pall of orthodoxy over the classroom. Next slide. And so again, it just keeps, we keep reiterating the reason why this is so critical, because at the end you see Justice Handler saying this freedom is clearly vital to the preservation of a free society. Next slide. William T. Coleman. A show of hands. How many people know William T. Coleman? A couple people. Okay, good. So there's some clue here. He's standing next to Thurgood Marshall. That'll tell you something. So William T. Coleman. He was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, graduated Phi Beta Kappa, went to Harvard Law School, and was the first African American to clerk on the U.S. Supreme Court for Justice Frankfurt. And he helped his fraternity brother, Thurgood Marshall, get ready for the biggest case in American jurisprudence, the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And even though Judge Coleman graduated at the top of his class, he still could not get a job. But he then became a partner and a managing partner in a major law firm, the Secretary of Transportation in the Ford administration. And in this instance, why I bring it up, he also was tapped to defend the IRS in a very important case. Now, you know this case is interesting when the IRS is the good guys. So, he was called in 1986 to defend the IRS because the IRS had made a determination that Bob Jones University no longer should have tax-exempt status because of their policy of racial discrimination. Bob Jones University is a Christian school that does not believe in interracial dating, and for a time did not believe in admitting anyone other than white students. And so because of that policy, the IRS said, and because of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, that Bob Jones should not be entitled to hold tax-exempt status. Why should they get a tax benefit for discrimination? And the president at that time, President Reagan and the Reagan administration, decided to support Bob Jones. And so because they decided to support Bob Jones, the IRS got private counsel, and they found the best lawyer they could. And so, again, looking at these competing interests, on the one hand, you have Bob Jones asserting First Amendment, freedom of religion, free exercise of religion, and the IRS saying that they should not be entitled to tax benefits if they are in violation of public policy and the law. And in a rare case, this is one of the rare cases where the government, the Supreme Court, ruled against academic freedom and exercise of religion. What they said was, you can exercise your religion, you can't get a tax benefit for exercising it in a discriminatory fashion. That's contrary to public policy. And so I put that case up, one, because he's one of my heroes, one of my role models, but also to kind of give a rare instance, an exception to the rule. Next slide. So, here in campus like HWS, this is really the issue that continues to address how we look at what can be taught in the classroom. And it's all over the place. And this is what it was getting at. So let's go to the next slide to kind of delve into this. We can go past this one. So one of the other issues that came up in higher education is how do you balance the university's need and right to maintain law and order and a right for free speech. So let's take the case of my wife's alma mater, LSU, when David Duke, who was a Nazi, wanted to protest and share his views about racial superiority. And so schools like LSU, what they did is they created zones where people could exercise their free speech, but not in a way that would disrupt the campus. And so what we're talking about here is this balance between giving persons the right to present their views, no matter how vehemently you may disagree, and have order on your campus. And so what the government created was what we call these time, place, and matter restrictions, where you have these zones, and many schools, particularly in the public context, have these areas of what we often call free speech alleys, where persons can literally get up and say whatever they want to say. And in the case of David Duke, he got up, he would dress in a Nazi uniform on campus, go to Free Speech Alley, and would espouse his view for hours, untouched. No one bothered him. He had his view, and people would just go back and forth to class. So that's this interesting compromise that was made. Because one of the other things that comes out of this important point is that the government has a very high burden if they want to infringe on someone's speech. They have to have a compelling reason to do so. And we saw that even national security was not enough to infringe on someone's speech. But in this instance, this was the compromise of having these zones where persons can get up and share their thoughts. As part of the civil rights movement, of the Vietnam movement, students were protesting on college campuses. And the issue was, is this appropriate? Can you do that? And more what we saw was that courts, campuses were grappling with these issues. And you can see that sign in the back, strike for free speech. And so this was the example of what happens on college campuses where students feel like they have to express their views. Next slide. We had it here in New York State. Now this is an interesting connection between the First Amendment and what other amendment is invoked here? Right to bear arms. That's a nightmare for me to holy cow. Have students not only exercising their free speech, but exercising their right to bear arms. But this was about, and the changes that were made at Cornell were in large part due to this protest. And what was done there was really a sense, and remember this was after Dr. King's assassination, so this move for nonviolence was waning, and the sense was that we have to take up arms to get and demand our rights. Next slide. Kent State. Another example of a situation gone wrong, where because of the protests against the war in Vietnam, the National Guard were called in, and things escalated pretty rapidly, and students were killed because of that action. And so one of the things every college president has to think about is how do you keep order on your campus? Because if you don't, it can often and has led to fatal results. Next slide. What is less known is another case in the same context in Jackson State, historically black colleges, where 2 students were killed. As you can see the bullet holes left by the National Guard. Next slide. This is what happens when things escalate. At the University of Wisconsin, it was actually a bombing in protest of the Vietnam War. Now again, it's obvious, but it bears mentioning that this was not peaceable assembly. In these other cases, you could argue that was what was going on, but here, this is what happens when things get perverted, and it again often leads to devastating results. Next slide. And fast forward to today. We had a controversial speaker on campus, University of California, Berkeley, and you can see what happened when things get out of hand. Next slide. University of Virginia, just the beginning of this academic year. You had students on campus during the summer session literally hunkered down in their dorm rooms because their campus was taken over by persons who held these views. And we all know, and we watched on what happened in the news both the night before and the night where, again, someone was killed as a result of these actions. And so how do we reconcile this protection of free speech and making sure that persons are safe? Next slide. And so in response to this, I thought it would be important for you all to see some of the responses to this action where persons who clearly have these views of hatred and racism. And you have the ACLU executive director saying the freedom of speech has to be valued and heralded as the cornerstone of our democratic society. Political leaders must shape the political discourse to underscore what binds us together as people rather than exploit our differences. And I question and I ask, is that what's happening? Next slide. Oh, go back. Okay. So we have, and what we're seeing is this real tension between protecting speech and protecting, and particularly on campuses where we say diversity and inclusion is something that we value. How do you reconcile those two things? How can you say we protect it, even speech we hate and speech about hate, and also promote inclusion? So, next slide. Just this semester, we have a student who posted something on social media. I hope this is a lesson to everyone, at the very least. Keep your ideas off social media if you're going to be that ridiculous. Yeah, well, you have the right to do it, but this is what she said. She said, I don't care if it's Martin Luther King Day, I'm still going to express my views. So, protected speech? Protected speech? Okay. Show of hands. How many people think this is protected speech? Don't be shy. Okay. All right. General Counsel, what do you say?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
All right.
Just saying.
All right.
No.
Yeah. So let's see what one of the renowned experts on free speech has to say about this. Next slide. I think the student would have a strong case for suing the University of Alabama for violating her First Amendment rights. Her speech is protected by the First Amendment, though it is offensive and uses epithets. Let's go back. That's what protected speech looks like. Now, just so you know, the president expelled her from school. So that's really what the issue is. So because a government actor infringed on someone's speech, is that appropriate? It's clearly offensive, and it's protected. Next 2 slides. So, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us? How do we both build community? How do we both build inclusive excellence while also giving space to ideas we hate and we vehemently disagree with? How do we do it? How do we make that work? How do we build this beloved community? How do we make students feel safe, faculty, staff feel safe, when there are people who can literally march on to campuses and wreak havoc and fear on campuses? How do we do that? How do we stay true to our democracy while also making sure that people are safe? It is the thing that keeps me up at night. It is the one thing that I don't have an answer for. And I dare say there's not a college president on this in America that has the answer to this question, which made this presentation both a lot of fun and a little scary. You never want to be a speaker and you're supposedly an expert and you don't have the answer, but it is absolutely the case. So I share that because that's something that we are going to have to grapple with. And how do we do that? How do we protect this marketplace of ideas and celebrate inclusive excellence? Are those things at complete odds? Is there a way to come to a common ground? Is there a way to do, like we had these time, place, and matter restrictions where you give people that space? Can a controversial speaker come to campus without fear of the campus being torn to shreds? Can you go to a presentation and listen to someone that you have views that are completely different than your own? Should we do it? Is it appropriate? Now, the reason why that's important is because there were people who thought Dr. King's views were in complete opposition to what we hold dear. Remember, Dr. King and Rosa Parks broke the law. It would not be slander to say that they were criminals. Dr. King was a lot of things. He also had a rap sheet. But I'll also tell you, and I said this last night, but it bears repeating, that we often talk about what's legal. I've devoted my life to upholding the law. It is also important to note that some of the most heinous acts in human history have occurred under a legal regime. So this idea that because it's legal, it's right, does not jive with what we know to be true. And so how do we make sense of this? And why the Supreme Court has been so consistent about this is because it's not the content that matters. It's the ability to utter, it's the ability to express your ideas. It's the ability to protect the press in their search for truth. It is the ability for you to complain about your government. Isn't it great to be able to write a letter to Lou Gordon and say, Lou, Mr. Supervisor, I do not like what's going on and I want you to do something about it. Doesn't that feel good? Isn't it good to be able to post all manner of things in your protest like we did on Saturday? Isn't that something that is wonderful about this country? But context matters. What is acceptable 200 years ago may not be politically correct now. And so we have to be careful what we judge as good speech, bad speech, what we agree with. And that's why I've come to admire my professor, and I was so glad to be able to share that with him, because I will tell you, we were in his office for almost an hour and a half, and I just said, we're just gonna have to agree to disagree, because I just can't. There's no way in the world I could defend Nazis and their right to protest. I just can't do it. He said, if you want to be a civil rights attorney, then yeah, you will. And that was something that I struggled with each and every day. But what I do know is that in today's society, today's world, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of religion is even more important today. When Thomas Jefferson was buried, there were several things on his tombstone. What was not mentioned was that he was president. What was noted is that he was the author of the Freedom of Religion Act in Virginia, where he said that we must protect the Jew, the Gentile, the Muslim, and the agnostic. This was back in the 18th century. And so our very foundation is going to depend on our ability to get this right, to get this balance right between our ability to be a community, a beloved community, and being able to accept and even celebrate the idea of people being able to share their views that you hate. So, let's return now to Dr. King. Next slide. And keep going. So, Dr. King said to us these words, but to give some context, in his last public speech, which came the day before he was assassinated, Dr. King spoke to a crowd in Memphis, Tennessee, protesting against the racial discrimination, poor pay, and dangerous working conditions for sanitation workers following the deaths of Eagle Cole and Robert Walker. The question, he said, was not, if I stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to my job? Not, if I stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to all the hours that I usually spend in my office every day and week as pastor? The question is not, if I stop to help this man in need, what will happen to me? The question is, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? In that same speech, Dr. King says that part of the solution to holding on to these rights is that we must use them. We must, as he said in Tennessee, cultivate a kind of dangerous unselfishness. So, beloved community, what are you doing for others? It is the same question today as it was then. Indeed, the issues Dr. King was addressing in 1968 are alive today. Political divisions, racial and economic injustices, nuclear armament, abuses of power, civil liberties, educational inequality, people talking past one another without taking the time to listen. These challenges are entrenched nationally and locally, but by no means permanent. It is the people of goodwill, as Dr. King said, like you all here tonight, who put their bodies and their souls in motion that will make a difference. We must be awake to the needs of others and put our bodies and souls into motion on their behalf. We must exercise our First Amendment rights so that America continually, truly, comprehensively lives up to what it says on paper. What are you doing for others? That question calls each of us to be, as Dr. King was, what he called a drum major for justice, a drum major for peace, a drum major for righteousness. Let us develop a dangerous unselfishness. Thank you all very much.
Thank
you, everybody, for being here, our friends from the community, students, faculty, colleagues, everybody, and thank you, President Vincent. I have to confess, I came here thinking, oh, so excited. I am going to get the answers because I have been going back and forth and back and forth. And you reminded me that the best speeches, the most powerful messages are those that leave us with questions when we leave. So cherish those questions. Let's continue thinking about these issues because they are critical. Always have been, but more so now, I think. Thank you so much. And now we will peacefully assemble outside and have desserts, okay? Thank you.